Well, good evening, everybody. This is the first in a series of interviews with Hong Kong Free Press. Tonight, we have Sharon Hom. She is the Executive Director of NGO Human Rights in China, Adjunct Professor of Law at the New York University School of Law, Professor of Law at the City University of New York School of Law. She has taught law for 18 years. She's often over in Hong Kong, and she's been advocating, of course, on behalf of the protest movement, most recently, I guess, at the China Commission headed by Marco Rubio in the US. So here she is. Sharon, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I think so much is happening.
Oh my
we
goodness,
all have a lot on our plates.
It's been a busy few days, even today, and we'll come to that in a moment. I first got to say though, you're extremely famous among the protesters on the LHK forum. They call you Auntie Sharon because of your robust arguments and eloquence during the China Commission hearings last year. So I just wanted to kick off with, what's your message to them at the moment? The protests have been in hibernation for, a couple of months. They've not gone away, but they seem to be returning now that the COVID situation is calming down. With it all kicking off again in Hong Kong, with the legislature today, the police watchdog report last week, what's your message to the protest movement?
I think that they should know that they've been and are a real inspiration to myself and to many of us out here. I think the moment now is because the strategies are both predictable, both locally and also from the central government. These strategies are predictable, and we can talk more about that. But I think what it also now requires is looking at strategies going forward. I think it's very important that I feel and I share when I watch these one after another outrageous developments, and we feel the anger, I share the anger, and I think what we need to do now is to ask the question, what strategies, it doesn't mean wholesale change, it means what did we learn, and what are we seeing is happening with the strategies and the way they're being manipulated and used against the movement, like the IPCC report, et cetera, is using certain aspects of the movement, like some of the violent incidents that occurred. So I think we need to be strategic, and that means being aware that the actions will be manipulated, will be misused, will be thrown back at us. If we throw something, it's going to come right back at us. So I think the biggest thing right now is that we think together about what kinds of strategies, and they're going to be broad and they need to be related, both domestic, that means at home in Hong Kong, and also internationally, and also online. So I would say there are these important advocacy venues, domestic, on the island, in Hong Kong, and also online is a big one because of COVID-19. So much of the world's business and governance, including the UN, has moved online. This presents a kind of different opportunity for us now. Well, because if it's online, we can be online too. We also can be online monitoring it all.
Before we move on to the COVID situation and China at the UN today, there's been, the WHO, there's been some announcements. You touched on there, things being thrown and then coming back at you. I think if we think about that in a more literal sense, a lot has been said in the IPCC report about protester violence, although it's often in the minority. I recall Mark Simon, the Apple Daily's #2, saying that the use of violence by protesters has made it really tough for advocacy in the US when talking to lawmakers there. And would life be a lot easier if this civil disobedience movement had kept peaceful? Because a lot of demonstrators say that, peaceful demonstration in 30 years hasn't worked. What is your take on the use of violence?
So I think there are several levels. Number one, from the perspective of the right to peaceful assembly, that right does not get abrogated for everyone if a small group or a group uses violent tactics. So it's quite clear that you cannot use the violence by any group of people to then trash the right to peaceful assembly and express ourselves and to raise issues and to gather in the streets of everyone else. That happens to be a clear international norm that protects peaceful assembly.
Well, the protesters will say, well, they don't want to split the movement, of course. The big thinking is there was such fragmentation over 2014. So how will we see those kinds of reforms in thinking and people expressing, their concerns without, causing arguments and infighting?
So I think that the infighting and the danger of splitting internally, that's the work of the movement. How it gets perceived and used outside, that's all our work, and that's something we can do to support. And I think the first thing we need to do is be very cautious and reject the story. So the IPCC told a story. That story, and they say there's a fact gap, we couldn't get all the facts, but that's not really what the IPCC problem is. It's not a fact gap. It's a credibility, a legitimacy gap, and it's also a fact gap. So it's a study that did not purport to resolve or find anything because it does not have investigation. So before we say the IPCC study has now condemned the violence and everything, I think we have to stop it. That's the first strategy. The news media that says police behavior exonerated, we should say no. Nobody was exonerated. They tried this. The study came out, and if you look at the study, they say we aren't able to find. It was a study, right, to get the big pictures, and then they did look at a period of time. But what period of time? They began in June 9th, and then they go up to looking at the incidents, the various incidents of Yunlong and Kaifang, etc. But the question is this: why did you start your study of the issues and the police violence issues on June 9th? In other words, things were in play well before June 9th. And if you want to understand, as the study purports to do, to understand the public's perceptions and the actions of the public and the actions of the police, you have to give it a context. And they're slicing it, beginning at June 9th, cuts off all of the context, which is critical. And the context is the fact that the SAR government, under the chief executive, under previous chief executives, has been encroaching and undermining one country, two systems. And the extradition amendments was a trigger that really you could see that this was accelerating. So if you cut off all of that context, as if suddenly out of the blue, Hong Kong people, some Hong Kong people, engaged in violent activities, you're not understanding that. That's not a very, it's a self-serving frame that the study group has adopted. And the fact that the three independent outside international experts left says volumes. So I think we're waiting for that interpretation. So I think one thing that when we hear the argument, and I respect Mark Simon's very strategic thinking. However, I think before we accept those kinds of concerns, I think we should stop for a moment and say, who's telling that story about the violence? Should we be accepting it? Because accepting that story erases. If you say, should we accept violence? Wrong question, wrong frame, wrong context. The context is there's a broad context for the social movement, for the social justice movement underway. And there's a broad principle. And I should point out that the report says these are the principles upon which the report will be based. And they say, principle 1, the duty of the police to maintain law and order. Number 2 principle, in accordance with the general orders and the police manual on use of force. Wrong principles. That's also like self-servingly narrowing the principle frame. What they neglected was that the police, the Hong Kong police force, is obligated and is accountable to the people. They're maintaining law and order, but they also have an accountability responsibility to the people. Secondly, the police manual is not the end of the standards. The standards are the international standards for use of force by law enforcement. And there are very clear standards on tear gas, on live ammunition, on when you escalate. And the first principle is de-escalate, not escalate. And that's what we've seen. Escalation after escalation. The first thing they go to is escalation. So I think that we need to bring back in so that we're not trapped in the prison that's being built. That is, if you take the rules of just the prison, we are trapped. There is a bigger rules that the prison guard doesn't get to make all the rules. The prison warden doesn't get to make all the rules. The prison exists in a broader context where there's rights, rule of law. They have to abide by that. In other words, they just can't close a door and then put us all in a black box.
Well, I think you're right. There's clearly a battle of narratives, and it was so clear when we saw the backdrop behind
Yes.
Carrie Lam last Friday with the truth about Hong Kong, battle of stories, as you put it. I want to move on to another platform where, we can advocate and express our concerns when it comes to the international level of law. And I know that you and human rights in China very much advocate for examining what's happened here from an international perspective, international law, with Hong Kong being a signatory of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And I know that the review is coming up for that. But when it comes to the UN, the WHO, we've seen Xi Jinping, speak tonight at the WHO. Whenever we speak, you talk about these mechanisms, but isn't China seeking to capture these mechanisms, these bodies? We know that it's trying to redefine human rights, populate UN bodies with its own friendly figures, strong arm, states into voting its way. Where is the capacity to effect any change when China seems to be, taking over the United Nations and all of its bodies, from even the aviation, body to the WHO?
So that trend, which has become increasingly more aggressive and open and obvious, and the combination of taking the high positions, the mask and aid diplomacy connected, and the threats, that whole package. On the one hand, we could say that shows that China's becoming more influential, right? On the other hand, we can also say this shows the level of, the weakness and the level of insecurity. Because what's at stake is it wants to be a legitimate world leader. And a legitimate world leader that threatens, buys, bribes, and uses all these mechanisms, puts up puppets everywhere, right, is not legitimate. And I think the international community actually knew that. But because of invested interests, like by the business sector, by the governments receiving aid, or governments, even Western so-called democracies, needed China to help with the region, North Korea, South China Sea, etc. So for those perceived self-interests, and to be fair, they're real interests, right? They turned away to say, yeah, China's doing all these, taking over to undermine the values, the principles, the mechanisms, the procedures. So we all saw that, but people turning away. The different moment now that we're in is COVID-19. This is a moment when a global crisis, the largest health crisis since World War II, is coming to the doors of almost every country in the world. And when it gets to your door, they're suddenly saying, those concerns we weren't really seriously concerned about, the rights of Chinese people, the rights to access information, the rights to express themselves, the rights of journalists, the rights of doctors to tell the truth or just to say the information they have. All of those rights, which I think tends to be like, oh yeah, freedom of expression, freedom of association, access information, suddenly became very real. The consequences of trampling on those rights when there's not information to deal with this pandemic, we are seeing the deadly consequences of censorship, information control, and a non-transparent governance, let's call it governance system. So I think there are governments now within the UN and also outside of the system who are beginning to take positions which, frankly, they were not courageous enough or had the political will enough in the past. So, for example, calling for an independent investigation of the origins of the COVID-19. And while China supports the WHO, as they say, after we have dealt with treatment and vaccine, and we'll deal with the investigation later, right? They are supporting the WHO. But a number of Western governments are supporting independent investigation. And I think that's important because of China's control and influence over the WHO, clearly. So there needs to be that. So my general, first, let's not assume that the lay of the land, the battlefield, stays static. There's a lot of moving pieces. And one of the things that has really changed the landscape is COVID-19, I think. It has, in every level, it has brought the problem home. The second thing it's done is China continues to tell its narrative, that we're telling the truth, we've been transparent, we're being helpful, we're a victim too, our people, and they're doing the same thing. Let's call on nationalism, we need national pride, we Chinese will survive. So they're pulling out all the cards that they have, but all of those cards, nationalism, patriotism, and we're victims too, and that we being the party state, we the people, we the country, we the system, collapsing it all of that was working in the past to fend off a lot of serious engagement and pushback, because they would say, you're interfering with us, you're outsiders, it's our sovereignty, etc. I think there's a shifting of the landscape now. And one thing you had asked me in the beginning, what I would say to the movement, and particularly the strategists in the movement, is recognize the openings. If we don't recognize the cracks, we won't be able to use them. If we assume that Xi Jinping speaking at the WHO, if we assume that he is going to be okay, okay meaning in power, from now until 2047, I think that's question mark. I think we should not assume when we say, what can we do? What should we do? What can the UN do? What can the international community do? I think the question is both descriptive. That is, let's look at the lay of the land. And the second thing is, what do we want it to do? The UN, which is complex, has the ICCPR review coming up. That's an independent review by a treaty body overseeing the ICCPR implementation by the Hong Kong government.
Well, before we move on to the Hong Kong, sorry, bit of a delay. I just wanted to touch on a couple of minutes ago. You have this optimism for other states and Western countries, speaking up and pushing back a little now, calling for these investigations with COVID and China. But what evidence are you seeing within China that there are these cracks and that their behavior in the international stage is changing? Because we also see it doubling down, this wolf warrior diplomacy, the spokespeople who seem to get rewarded for saying ever crazier Trumpian style things and defensiveness on Twitter, exporting censorship to some weaker states around the region. You have these sort of economic traps, if you will, of one belt, one road, and they can rely on, all of those countries to defend them on the international stage. And you mentioned allowing an investigation after it all settles down, but it's by the WHO, who have been extremely supportive, suspiciously so, some reckon, from the outset. So where do you see the optimism within China on the international stage? Because it seems they're doubling down.
Yeah, so let me be clear that I may project optimism. That's a misreading. That's a misreading. So let me say what you see is like optimism is actually this. It's strategic positive, like the fact that I don't believe we should just give up on imperfect tools, on imperfect forum, on imperfect tribunals, on imperfect procedures does not mean I'm optimistic. It means that we need to use everything that exists, recognize their limits and imperfections, and one of the things about the UN, it's one of its major weaknesses is that it's state-centric or dominated by governments. But the other piece of it is, it's also a system in which the role of civil society, us, non-governments, has been and continues to be supported. And lots of the COVID-19 additional guidance that has come out from the UN has sent, for me, at least two important messages. One, amidst a crisis, governments don't get a pass for human rights violations. Second message, whatever crisis, and even though this is the largest global crisis we face since World War II, health crisis, the human rights protections, the human rights responsibilities of governments are the same. And the difference is they have now issued additional clarifications and guidance on emergency measures. So those emergency measures make it quite clear that you can't say, we have an emergency, so now we're going to derogate from all of our obligations and rules. So when we say the UN, let's be clear what we're talking about. We're talking about first, the values, the principles, and the standards. That's our foundation. If we don't hold on to that, we are standing on the foundation of Chinese dream, Chinese rule of law, elections with Chinese characteristics, as we saw in LegCo. We're looking at human rights with Chinese characteristics. And so therefore, why I think in our strategic thinking, and that why I would say from not optimism that it works, but it's like, do we have a better idea? Do we think that instead of standing by the international human rights system, which is still the system, China is in taking the leadership positions, attacking the norms, attacking the procedures, but the fact remains, as we sit now, that system is still the normative, legitimate system. Anything else that China's peddling, it's different models, that's not the norm. It's not the system. So you can say whatever you want. China can go and say, we have a better idea, but the fact remains that the international community, through its governance structure, through the international system, has not said, you know what, we're rewriting the UN Charter this year, since it's the anniversary, and we're going to now say that the purpose of the Charter is the Chinese dream, and that the purpose of the Charter is that we're building a community of shared future for mankind. See, so the government of China, the party state, can write that into its constitution. It doesn't make it the UN Charter. So I think we need to not have preemptive obedience, and I don't think we should preemptively let their declaration of their better model and victory and everything, I think it's rather premature when the system, the principles, the procedures are all still working. Now the battle, their attack on it is quite serious. So I think we need to get smart, we need to be strategic, and we need to figure out what of the system, where are the openings. So number one, China is going to run. It's going to announce its bid for the Human Rights Council, see, because it's not on the council right now. It had to rotate off. So when it submits its candidacy, there's an opportunity because there's a hook. And I think for the media needs a hook. So that's a great hook at that point to ask the question, do we really want China as a member of the Human Rights Council, right? And there's a moment to look at the record. Now, China's going to usually, as part of the package, make promises. Then we should say, really? Promises? Let's look at the record. They did not respect their obligations and treaty obligations to Hong Kong. They're not respecting those obligations. Why would we believe that any representations and promises they make in their candidacy are going to be respected? So I think there's that opportunity. The Human Rights Committee will be meeting in July remotely, and they will be adopting a list of issues for Hong Kong. And so
is
a
human
number
rights
of
in China submitting anything as I should just
Yeah,
explain
we're
a little
working
bit.
on it.
Yeah, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the deadline is coming up. Since Hong Kong is a signatory, a lot of civil society groups have the opportunity to submit their findings and their opinions as to whether Hong Kong has been keeping up with international law on this. Yeah, so you're about to move on to what's going to happen and any submissions you may be making. But if you can also tell us, how useful is this, and should we not be wary of the fact that no matter what the conclusions are with this, we always see the same old press releases from the local government and from Beijing, often complaining of foreign interference.
So the foreign interference argument is ridiculous vis-a-vis the Human Rights Committee, because that's the committee that oversees the implementation by the Hong Kong government, and that by treaty, that's their role. The Chinese government mission to the UN, very hostile, very aggressive pushback to the special rapporteurs. These are independent experts who have expressed concerns about Hong Kong and have been expressing concerns for quite some time, both after June, what happened on police violence, on the arrests. They have expressed once again, most recently, that the arrests of the 15 pro-democracy figures, that they all should be released. And as we know, that the Chinese mission's response was interference, this is beyond your mandate. So I think this kind of over-the-top reaction by the Chinese mission, really shows how really out there they are. Because number one, that is the mandate of the experts. The experts' mandate in freedom of expression, freedom of association, the rights of human rights defenders, their mandate is for the whole world. And whenever they see the rights being endangered, weakened, threatened, etc., their part of their mandate is to speak out and say, to engage with the government of concern and say, we are concerned. In some cases, they will speak more privately first and then publicly. They've done all of the above over the last few months. They privately, but on legislation, like on the threats and invocation of terrorism and use of the anti-terrorist laws being threatened and thrown around in a very wild, irresponsible way by the chief executive, by the police, and by Beijing, terrorism. You can't throw those words around that irresponsibly. Hence why more than 9 experts said you can't do this in terms of terrorism. The Special Rapporteur on Countering Terrorism, Protecting Human Rights while Countering Terrorism, they issued the statement, and then China said, you're interfering, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that when you say, what is the use of it if we know the chestnuts that they're going to throw back and say interference, beyond your mandate, unfriendly to the Chinese people, anti-China. We know what they're going to say. So why do we want to put the list of issues in? So the stage right now is not the full findings and reports of NGOs. We have an opportunity in the next couple of weeks, the deadline is end of the month, is that we can put in concerns and issues, because what's happening next stage is not the review yet. So what will happen next stage in July is that the Human Rights Committee will look at all of the suggestions from civil society, and like the Hong Kong Journalists Association, I know they're working on something too, and I hope they're saying press freedom, media, press freedom. Human rights groups are putting in, lawyers should be putting, so we're all putting in, but we're putting issues on the table. Then what the committee will do in July is adopt a list of issues. So they will say, we've got all these issues. This seems to be what people are very concerned about. They will discuss it. Then they will adopt a list. The list will be made public. That list will be sent to the Hong Kong SAR government. Before the actual review, the Hong Kong government must provide written answers to those issues. So for example, if we put a list of issues on the IPCC and say, given that the IPCC has no investigative powers, did not call witnesses, and it was beyond their remit to make any conclusions about a responsibility for actions, then here's a question we could say is, please provide information on any specific measures the Hong Kong SAR government intends to adopt to ensure that a full independent investigation, as has been recommended by international experts, by the bar, by local bar, by international experts. What are you doing about an independent investigation? So the purpose of using the system is targeted. We're trying to get the Hong Kong SAR government, not like the chief executive does domestically, just ignore everybody, is that they have to have a response. They have to submit something.
Well, that's
so we want the right.
Yeah, sorry. I know time's short, so I wanted to touch on this because, you know, away from international law, what the Hong Kong government is doing, they're often stuck between rock and a hard place. If you can fathom an iota of pity for them sometimes, in that they have to balance the business interests, Hong Kongers, and they're answerable, you know, almost to everything when it comes to Beijing and ensuring that these kinds of protests never happen again. Their hands are tied, really, and often people believe Carrie Lam to just be, a figurehead and a manager of public life. You see these frantically pulling different levers, like terrorism, as you mentioned, to try and do something. They cannot agree to the protesters' demands because Beijing won't let them, and of course, it cannot be demonstrated that these kinds of protests work. So what can they do when they are so trapped, other than this idea of enacting a truly independent police investigation? If they can't submit to the protesters' demands, what's your message to the Hong Kong government, since we kicked off with your message to protesters?
Well, I will try very hard, but it's hard to get a lot of sympathy up here for the Hong Kong government. But when you say they're balancing business interests and the orders from above, you know, I think that we're missing the big part to which the Hong Kong government is accountable, and that's the 7.4 million people. It's to the people. So I have said this earlier to the chief executive. I wrote her the open letter in Hong Kong Free Press. Clearly, she did not read my letter. And I said, look, it was a hard job. You stepped into it with your eyes wide open. And that means you should do your job properly and take the consequences. It's irresponsible to step into the job and know that you were stepping in between a rock and a hard place and not be prepared to do what needs to be done to be responsible to the Hong Kong people. So that could mean you getting sacked. It could mean other consequences to you, etc. So and that if you're going to, you could make a principled statement. I think, frankly, she should resign, but she didn't want to resign. And I think that what is going to be likely is they're going to just put another, incompetent, inefficient, puppet in. So that's why when I say to governments, it's that the message to government is, the writing is on the wall. To the Hong Kong government, the writing is on the wall. You can try like what they did with this massive juggernaut over the last week, 10 days. You can try issuing the IPCC report. You can try, the arrest of the 15. You can try having the fake election and LegCo. You can do all of these as messages to Hong Kong people that you're fighting a losing battle because we got all these balls. We've got everything. We've got all the tools. But what we can't forget is the writing on the wall was the district council elections. Beijing's took a beating. And that's why they have to now go through all of this manipulation of procedure and putting in puppets. And so what we should see it at now is a ramping up of all of these tactics, because they know they will face a risky situation in September for the LegCo elections. They will not get legislation passed that they want. So if they can't get legislation passed by a democratically elected legislature, what they're doing is what authoritarian dictatorships do. You put in the people you want, you remove the people, you imprison people, you muzzle the press. So you do all these things, and these are all the tactics of an authoritarian regime. And as we know through history, since Xi Jinping loves to say, we should learn more about Chinese history and history. Yeah, let's look at Chinese history. You know, the Imperial China, you know, each imperial regime didn't last long either. Empire in history did not last forever. And as I've said previously, there is a expiration shelf life for them. And it usually is around the 70th year, 72 maybe, some have made it to 72. So we've got expiration date. And the last thing I think I would say is that we are facing 3 major global crises simultaneously. Probably man-made. The health crisis and human rights. These are all global crises. And climate change, health pandemic, and human rights, it will not be effective to deal with health if it's not within a rights-based framework. So why, not only because I'm a human rights lawyer and activist, it's that if you don't put people, like not business interests, not the interests of Beijing to keep a one-party state going, not the interests of Xi Jinping to keep his vision of the future and the world imposed on the whole, not those interests. But if we take the interests of the whole planet, right, and we take the interests of human dignity, and what it means at the heart of everything is human dignity. That's the right to life, that's the right to health, that's housing, that's employment, that's work, that's dignified, that's not healthcare workers being exposed, you know, not the front line, you know, telling them they're heroes, but then exposing them. No, what's at heart is people. People have to matter. And human rights, I would say, we have to emphasize humans, and humans that are responsible for each other and for our stewardship of the rest of life on the planet. And so, you know, that sadly, Tom, is not a new battle. And we do have a new dimension of it, particularly now. And I do think it is not only the revolution of our time, it's the test of our time, that are we going to rise to it? And I don't think, as all of history, we should be expecting the governments to rise to it. It's that the people are going to lead, and eventually the government will either be overthrown or they will follow. It's not governments that lead. We can see that we are in this disaster because of the government's inability, the world, China, and other governments to govern in a way that is responds to and protects the rights and the interests of all people, not just the small elite, you know, political economic elite, but all of us. And so I think we should be looking, despite all the unknowns about COVID-19 and the resurgence and everything, I do think we should start some scenario thinking, so that in the post-COVID-19 era, we should reject every single call to return to normal. We will not return to normal, because the normal state of the world is what brought us to this 3 major crises that we're in. It was the normal state that created this climate change crisis that's going to maybe destroy an existential crisis. And the pandemic, we are here because it was a normal business as usual, not taking human health seriously enough. And the human crisis we're in now is because authoritarian dictatorships and regimes have been all around the world. The rise of neo-fascism, homophobia, the rise of divisive, you know, hate, all of that is a crisis that has been rising and building with enormous human suffering and pain. So we don't want to return to that. We don't want to return to let's get on with, you know, that crisis. That I think we should start alternative scenario asking, the UN can be different. We, as civil society participants, we imposing and exerting pressure on different governments, they should speak up. The UK should speak up now at the UN more. They should speak up now for Hong Kong. They should insist on their rights as a treaty, as the other state that signed the joint declaration. they should speak up and say, we're the other party and they're violating it, and we want to start looking at our remedies under the Vienna Convention on Treaties. There's a law on treaties when states break treaties. So people should start alternative scenario thinking like that and say, what are the remedies that we should be asking the UK government to step in? Individual parliamentarians, former governors have been speaking up. Not enough. It's just not good enough. We need the UK government to start exercising its role and its function as a, the joint declaration, the 1984 joint declaration. So I think we like to begin thinking about bottom up. It's always going to be people bottom up. The top looks like it's powerful, looks like it's controlling everything, but at the end of the day, it's bottom up that's going to effectuate changes. As we saw in Hong Kong, it's bottom up. It's not going to be, say, Carrie Lam initiate some reforms. It's going to be bottom up. And I think your question is right. Did she learn anything? Did Beijing learn anything from the fact that ramming down legislation that is clearly unpopular, that clearly the Hong Kong people don't want? Is that a good strategy? And I think what we should keep in mind is, even if they successfully pass the anthem law, even if they successfully pass, an Article 23, whatever they pass doesn't make it a just law. It doesn't make it good law, and it doesn't make it law that complies with the Hong Kong government's obligations under international standards. So if you pass the anthem law, as I can imagine it might look, it will probably violate international standards and guidelines on when fundamental rights can be restricted. You can restrict freedom of expression, but you have to be necessary, proportionate, necessary in a democratic society.
Yeah.
So you have to comply.
I should explain that I was telling Sharon earlier that we plan to ask Carrie Lam if she feels she's repeating some of these mistakes from last year, because it was exactly a year ago that she was trying to force through some unpopular legislation, causing legislative chaos. I know you need to get going, so I do appreciate these broad food for thought you've left us with just then. Although one of our commenters has said that Carrie Lam isn't allowed to resign. I know that the protesters have kind of dropped that demand because they fear they'll get someone worse. And I think you're true. A lot of what's going on now is all about the run-up to the legislative elections. Before we go, I just wanted to ask, a more personal question. As partly, I want to understand: are you on lockdown, or what the hell is happening right now in the US? And what has motivated you all of these years, this long career, your enthusiasm, you the Energizer Bunny, I often like to call you, your passion and eloquence over this stuff. Where's this fire coming from, Sharon? And is it true, according to the bio you've given me, you've got 12 cats? Are they with you now?
Yeah, they're all around me. I have 13.
Good God,
and
Sharon.
One dog. And one dog. I'm a failure as a foster home for the dog. So though I was a foster and now I'm failed, and now he's got his home here with me, and he's quite demanding. Thank you for those very kind words. So thank you, Tom. Actually, I don't keep going like an Energizer Bunny that you might think, and that it's always a struggle. And I think that when people outside like you and on my Facebook or on my Twitter, I get so many comments and thoughts. And I think what really actually keeps me going is you folks, because I watch you and your Hong Kong Free Press team, and you're out there and all the time covering what needs to be covered to get the news out to us, and so that we can see what's happening. And then I have these wonderful messages of solidarity and concern, and from, and then during the holidays, I got these wonderful handmade, beautiful cards from people in Hong Kong, like amazing cards, like this hand drawn and artwork. I actually have one right here. If I turn the camera, you could see it. It's right here in front of me. It's the
yeah, we get them too.
Actually.
Yeah, sure. That's
you see
Pepe.
it?
Yeah.
That was one of my, it was sent to me, and it was just wonderful. But so I think that the way I and each of us keeps going is, I think, number one, we have to figure out what in our personal space. I know you were trying to do yoga. I'm not a yoga person. It's too calm for me. It's like way too calm. But I do think we need to maintain our self space. And I don't do a good job of that. But the 13 cats and the dog, because they don't care about what I need. They're like, hey, what about us? So that gives me a really good nurturing space, and I love them, and it gives me a good space to care for them. And then I really do think staying connected to each other. We have, I live in Queens, which was the epicenter of the epicenter of New York City. And so we've been home for over 2.5 months. Yeah. So that's, we've been working full out, harder than normal. But it's the connections that will keep all of us going. And you could think of it as we might be in lockdown, but in many ways, a lot of us are in different versions of lockdown. And the only way we're going to keep not just only our optimism, but our spirit up and to keep each other going is staying connected. And so I think that's very important that we stay connected and, hear each other and then share, what keeps each of us going, and share like good things. I shared something nice and then I got trashed because they said, why did you share that nice thing? Because we're all suffering. And I go, I shared it nicely because we're all suffering. And we need to, we need to remember, like those moments, you need moments, where you're grateful. You're grateful, for your parents. You're grateful for your friends. You're grateful for your animals. You're grateful for your colleagues. You're grateful for the work. I think we should be very grateful in this time when it's so like we're moving into a very dangerous moment that's anti-facts in the US and anti-science. It's very close to the McCarthy era, and we're seeing that resurgence here. It's frightening. And so that's why in this moment we have to keep each other grounded. We need to be grounded, and we need to be grounded in reality, because reality still matters. I think was it W.C. Fields who said, you can fool some of the people all the time, all the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. No matter how powerful your narrative, your official narrative, your local narrative, the truth will come out. The voice of Dr. Li Wenliang, you can't silence that. The truth will come out. So I think the work we need to do, and my job is to keep myself up and to support other people so that we think in a good, positive way, that we don't give up. And I think it's okay to have days, as I have, or moments, when you just go, this is crazy, this is too much, this is exhausting, this is that. And then you go, okay, it is. Have a nice cup of tea, get yourself together, and then get on with it. Just get on with it. We'll do what we can do, because that's all we can do. And I am very grateful for all of the, not just the young people in Hong Kong, the creativity. I'm convinced that if the movement and the young people and the older, wiser people, the pro-democracy activists who have been at this for decades, I think Hong Kong's going to come through this, but the work is, where do we want to be, and let's not just think of fighting the now. Where do we want to be? What other 2047 alternate realities can we envision? I'm a Trekkie.
Me too.
Yeah, I know. So I posted the Kobayashi Maru on my Facebook, and there was a long debate by many young people on it, and said, well, I said that's what has to happen. The test is rigged. The test is rigged. We change the rules. We hack the test. We keep the good rules and we hack the test. And you can save the crew and survive the ship. So we're going to save the ship and have the whole crew survive, and save the other ship too. So yeah, let's just stay calm and carry on. And we could carry on with everything, with anger, but we also have to carry on with like strategic patience, and also support each other. And thank you so much for doing this, Tom. I think there's so much going on, and we were just all over the map. But I hope that that your new series, looking at talking to those of us, in lockdown, And hopefully next time I'll be out in the streets in Hong Kong and back there.
All right.
I was hopefully back there teaching, but here I am. But I look forward to coming back, and I hope everyone stays safe. Everyone stays safe.
Thank you very much,
too,
Sharon. Sharon, stay on the line a moment. I'm going to sign off here, but I want to thank Sharon Hom, the Director of Human Rights Watch. Sorry, keep doing this. Human Rights in China, for joining us, law professor over there on lockdown in New York. Thank you very much, Sharon, for joining us. This will be on YouTube later and on our website tomorrow. Thank you.